Welcome to the Buddhist Recovery Network podcast. My name is Jake Koenig, and I'll be today's host. Before diving in, I invite you to take a look at our newly revamped website at BuddhistRecovery.org, where you'll find meetings, resources, and more. Also, join us in person for the 2024 International Buddhist Recovery Network Summit, happening this October 10th to the 13th at the Fairview Lake YMCA in Stillwater, New Jersey. Join us for a transformative weekend hosted by the Buddhist Recovery Network, featuring esteemed speakers like Kevin Griffin, Vimalasara, Vince Cullen, and new voices. Key highlights include: what does a safer Sangha mean to you? Navigating process addictions, neurodiversity and Buddhist recovery, self-compassion workshops, talks on building and sustaining meetings, forgiveness, gratitude, we'll have a special celebrity appearance, and much, much more. This isn't just a conference, but will also be run like a retreat. We'll be sharing meals and lodging, including aspects of a retreat like meditation, yoga, music, and more. Even more exciting, we're offering a 30% discount to podcast listeners with the code FRIENDSONTHEPATH. The discount code link is in the show description, which will take you right to the registration page. Main programming starts Friday morning. Experience the beauty of the Fairview Lake nestled in the Delaware River water gap. To learn more, see our website or go to the Summit website at BuddhistRecoverySummit.org. Again, podcast listeners are being offered a 30% off discount this once-in-a-lifetime experience. We hope to see you there. Now, on to today's episode. Today's episode is with Sitaram. Sitaram spent several years serving his beloved teacher Ramdas on Maui, where he was shown the path of Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of service and devotion. As the director of the Sacred Community Project and a member of a musical group called Kripa, he works to lower the barriers of access to contemplative and devotional practice through affordable, free, and donation-based offerings, spiritual support, and prison outreach. His book, From and For God, is an intimate and contemplative collection of writings on the spiritual path. I truly enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you will too. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time. Now, on to Sitaram. Hi, Sitaram. Thank you very much for joining the Buddhist Recovery Network podcast. I'm very excited to have you on. So before we were recording here, I would have read out a biography of yours. But that being said, I wanted to start off this recording with a question, and you can feel free to answer this any way it hits you. But to start this off, my question is, who is Sitaram?
Good question. I'm just going to start with where my mind is writing on first. So, Sitaram is a name, first of all, and it's a spiritual name that was given to me by my teacher Ramdas, and it's the name that I pretty much use for the majority of my life. My parents know me and call me by my birth name, which is Ken, but most of my friends anymore, Sitaram is the name that I go by. And the reason for that is that it's a deeply meaningful name for me, in part for two reasons, really. One is that it directly connects me to Ramdas and this lineage I'm a part of, and it was really important for me to have a name from him as my teacher. And especially since he died and left his body, which was about 4 years ago now. It's like a legacy of his that I have, right? It's this legacy of love. It makes me think of him, it makes me think of my connection to him. The other part of it is that the name has a meaning, right? That's why I received that name. It's not a title, it's a name that has meaning. It's something to inspire me to grow into. It's a reminder of my path. And the meaning has to do with being of service to God, to the divine, to humanity. And I think that's another big part of the reason why it's important to me, is that I, in this lifetime, that's something that I want to keep growing towards. Yeah, so that's what that name means. Who I am, just like who all of us are, like we're deeper than any definition or name or social role. But in terms of what my mind uses, the identities that I find most useful for myself, the ones that help me to achieve greater freedom rather than to be more rigidly trapped, those are the roles that have to do with being of service in some way, something that's beyond my own ego gratification. And so taking on a role of being of service is one way that I keep aspiring to do that.
Thank you. Yeah. And I definitely want to touch upon some of the names and the practices you mentioned for people who may not be introduced, people like who may not know who Ram Dass is or your practice at all. But before we do so, I like to ask guests to take it back a bit and talk a little bit about your upbringing. Were you raised in a religious household? Was there spirituality in your household? And would you mind just giving maybe a little bit of an overview on your path and how you have gotten to the point of where you are today?
Yeah. I was born in the mid-'80s in a small town called Snoqualmie in Washington State. The town I grew up in was within driving distance to Seattle, which is the biggest city in Washington, but the town itself at that time had a population of about 2,000 people. So a really small mountain town. It's since grown bigger. And in a lot of ways, I had a very simple life. I had a lot more freedom than I think a lot of kids did, even during that time, in terms of my neighborhood was relatively safe. There was woods behind the house, and so, it wasn't uncommon for me to just go back in the woods and build forts and ride bikes and for hours, and my parents not to know where I was, to go fishing on my own in the river, things like that. My parents, I was not raised spiritual or religious. My parents, like many people of their generation, were raised in the Christian church, and they, for various reasons, decided when they were a younger person that they didn't believe in that, and that wasn't something that they found helpful. And so I essentially was raised in an agnostic home. And there's a few things about that I do think are important to mention, and that are still to this day integral into even my own spiritual outlook, which is that this idea of questioning things and being very uncomfortable with not knowing, recognizing that a lot of beliefs are crutches that serve to keep us comfortable. And just a willingness to ask more questions than to have answers. And that is something that they very much instilled in me, and that I still very much approach the spiritual path with that. There's probably other things I could mention, but yeah, after me saying that, do you have any follow-up curiosities?
I do, yeah. This actually brings up to the front. This was kind of like a big question that I was planning on asking towards the end of it, but I think it just came up, so it might even be a little controversial, but I think it's having you on, I would like to ask it. So this being about Buddhist recovery, from the Buddhist Recovery Network, a lot of people who are in Buddhist recovery have first went to some traditional recovery, like a lot of 12-step programs, and as a part of those programs, a relationship with a higher power is a part of that. And a lot of people struggle with that, and maybe they were raised in a household where we can call God was a very scary figure or judgmental figure, or maybe they have more of a scientific mind and they cannot make that connection. So a lot of people I talk with in my work with BRN are people who are trying to find refuge in a path that doesn't require a connection with a higher power. That being said, you are someone who's taken the name on, Sitaram Das. I mean, I think, if I'm understanding correctly, your name almost literally means servant of God. And it is a funny juxtaposition that, on one hand, that is the name you take, and of course, and this is what you dedicate your life to, but on the other hand, you're saying things like, I think it's really important to go into this journey with a healthy dose of skepticism and not blind faith, while on the other hand, I would say that you're also very faithful. So I think that from what I know about your tradition and Ram Dass and all of that, I don't think you are in the you're not in the game of trying to convert people or convince people of anything, but I do think that you are someone who could maybe not change the perspective, but offer your perspective to people who, when they hear the G word, they just go, not me, that's just an aversion to that. So what would you say to those people?
Yeah, that's a great question. It excites me actually that we're starting off with this, because this is one of my favorite topics. So, first off, just to step back for a second, my teacher, Ram Dass, his name also literally means servant of God. Sitaram is just a different name for God than Ram. And Ram Dass is someone that actively practiced Buddhism, sought out Buddhist teachers, and went to Buddhist meditation retreats and did that throughout his life. And when he co-taught retreats, especially towards the end, the ones he would do in Maui, the majority of the teachers that would come and teach alongside him were Buddhist teachers. So that is in the particular lineage I'm a part of, that's just a integral part of the understanding, is that there's different paths up the mountain, and although they're very different and they function different in a lot of different ways, and those differences are important, there is an underlying truth that is just universal that they're pointing at, sometimes with seemingly opposite concepts and understandings. So that's kind of a base. With that, it makes total sense to me, based on the huge amount of religious trauma that a lot of us carry, and that really, if we think about it, the entire Western culture in the United States specifically carries. Like, it's like a cultural religious trauma that we have. It just makes sense that, like, anything that remotely looks like that might not be good for a lot of people, right? And so finding other paths where they can seek out their own freedom and sense of meaning and purpose and all of those things, like, that's incredibly beautiful. Like, that exists, that there's spiritual paths that exist that don't have some conception of a higher power. Where I like to push back a little bit is this idea that I think a lot of us have, and that at one point in my own journey I had, which is that somehow Buddhism or these paths of self-inquiry, meditation paths, that somehow these don't involve taking on extra beliefs, but somehow devotional paths do. And I think that just stems more from a misunderstanding of how devotional paths work and how they function. So when we talk about a higher power or God, we're essentially talking about a placeholder, a label that we're using to orient us to the mystery. in some way. But it's also a particular type of label that opens up different avenues of practice that might not be available otherwise. And it is a part of our innate human nature to love, to worship, to give praise to, right? And when we're in these states, it feels good. I mean, we feel really aligned. And like if we've ever had a moment of just having sincere just gratitude or adoration for a really close friend that maybe just did something amazing for us, right? And we get a chance to express that, like we come alive in some way through that act. In a lot of ways, what we normally think of as our ego kind of takes a back seat. And we get to just be totally present with this spontaneous, this life force coming through of praise and adoration and gratitude.
Yeah.
So it's an innate human quality. And what devotional practices are really about is cultivating a type of relationship with the mystery where we can fully express these soul's yearnings of love and gratitude and praise and prayer and adoration, and to do so in an environment, if it's in the right context, that's safe, right? So, for instance, in a lot of fundamentalist religion and in cults, and in all sorts of areas like that, it's not necessarily safe to like really worship something, right? Because we can be taken advantage of. But if we have the right context, the right conceptual context of understanding the mystery, and it doesn't even require that we believe in that, just as a placeholder even, then we can start to engage in the type of devotional practice that in the direct moment, the same way that we experience through meditation, in the direct moment of giving our longing or our love to some higher power, we get to feel the direct embodiment of what that feels like and the innate validity of it. And that's beyond belief. So it's just a different framework for navigating this mystery to awaken these innate qualities of what I would call inherent in the soul.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I think that clears a lot up, and I think that is something that even people who don't go down that path can get behind and understand. So what that brings up for me, and a question I want to ask you, is when I think about those on the devotional path, I think about kirtan, which is singing, chanting. I think about immense love, sitting, singing with each other, maybe dancing, just trying to channel this big love, right? This feeling of loving awareness. What I want to, as today is a representative of this devotional path, what I want to bring into that picture is suffering. Is the other side of this, that the not just the singing and this kind of loving energy, because in the meetings that the BRN puts on, a lot of that is sitting with people in immense suffering. And I just wanted to put the question to you of, on your path, or maybe generally, what do we do with suffering? How can we transform suffering? How can we tolerate suffering? And maybe this is something you can tackle too, is there meaning in suffering? Because there's a lot of really hard things that people who are suffering from addiction have gone through. And the question is, why did this happen? Why me? So I will lay the concept of suffering to you, and I would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Okay. I think it's helpful to think about separating for a moment my own suffering versus the suffering around me, suffering in the world. On one level, it's all suffering, but giving those separate categories has been helpful for me in terms of navigating how to skillfully approach suffering. So you started by bringing up kirtan, right? So the devotional chanting of the names of God, right? So and we do that as an act of praise or love, right? You brought up those terms, and it can awaken a sense of loving awareness, the sense of our natural capacity to love. But through that practice of chanting the names, we also develop a taste for the name, as it's called, and a relationship with the name, right? So I've been chanting the same names now for close to 20 years. It's like they've become these friends. And in moments when I am steeped in suffering, it doesn't feel like I can sit down and meditate, because I have my own meditation practice. In moments when I don't even know what I believe anymore, in moments when I can't tell up from down, right? Just those total states of just utter confusion and immense suffering, just so twisted up. In those moments, the only thing that I can do is to take refuge in the name, right? And so that's calling out, right, these names of this mystery, with as much yearning and just even just suffering, right? Just uninhibited, just like calling out the way that a child might cry out to their mother, right? And so so that's another element of that, is that sometimes having just a place to pour our suffering to when we don't know where else to put it, sometimes that alone can transform it. And for me, that is, when nothing else is working, that's what's left. And I wanted to say that because you brought that up, and it points to another nature of just the devotional path. So with suffering, the incredible thing about my time with Ram Dass, and for anyone who doesn't know, spiritual teacher from the last century, and died 4 years ago at the age of 88, and had a stroke 20 years before that, and so spent the last 20 years of his life in a wheelchair with aphasia, difficulty speaking, and immense pain in his body, and really one of the main things in my life that has deepened my spiritual path is my time spent with him as his caregiver. And what I saw in those intimate moments was that real suffering, I mean real physical body pain, a mind that struggled to say words, right? I mean what we normally think of as suffering, like just like a lot of things sucked, right? Just like pain, like some types of pain are just painful. I also saw that you brought up the term loving awareness, which was a word that Ram Dass talked a lot about, and that it was real for him. Like it was a real state that he resided in, and it was a real practice that he engaged in terms of, yes, there's all this pain in his body, but he actively practiced holding that in love, right? So not resisting it, not fighting it, not wishing it wasn't there, but not being neutral about it either. Like truly holding it in a soft, merciful presence of what we might call loving kindness, or for those on a devotional path, there are states of devotion where we see the entire world as a manifestation of God, and that means our own physical pain, that we can experience that with the same love that we might experience as looking at a picture of a saint or a deity. And so I saw that, from Ram Dass, that real. It's a real possibility for us as humans. That even immense pain and suffering, that we can hold that in love.
Yeah.
What I found working with others is that same quality, by holding other people's suffering in love, that's what allows me to show up and be present in the deepest and most whole way that I'm able, right? So it's not that like I wouldn't even tell another person like, I love your suffering, because I wouldn't communicate what I want to communicate. But me wrestling with and fighting their suffering in my own being isn't doing anyone else any service, right? But if I can hold another person's suffering with the wholeness of my being, without resistance, holding it in love with an open heart, then I'm fully present with someone. And that's how I believe that transformation happens in human relationships. It isn't from us trying to fix each other. It's just like us being as deeply connected as possible, right? Like, can I be with someone else's experience with as close as possible the same depth of awareness that they are? And even if someone else is still wrestling with it, can I hold that experience and the wrestling? Can I hold that in a presence for both of us? And somehow, through some magical way, it seems like we all have to do our own work, but that creates the type of environment where suffering can change when it's ready to.
Thank you for that. And I want to talk about love later and how that fits into its path. But before I do, since we're on the topic of suffering, I want to zoom in on maybe a specific but very prevalent and becoming ever more prevalent aspect of suffering, and to pose a question to you. And I pose this question to you as you are someone who has spent a lot of time exploring, thinking about the mind, your own mind, working with other people, and spending time with incredible teachers who have great understanding of the mind. So again, just like my first question, you could take this question as broad or specific as you wish, but the question is, what is addiction? What is addiction?
That's a good question. Because a lot of people, I mean, if we look around, right, we're going to see very different definitions. Right? Someone like Gabor Mate might define addiction differently than someone more immersed in like the behavioral sciences, for instance. So generally, a working definition of addiction that seems to be helpful in most circumstances is it's a type of attachment that is causing pain and suffering in our own life, and that we perceive great difficulty or inability even to let go of it, right? So a lot of that is very personal, right? Because like, I don't know, for instance, what one person considers to be an addiction, another person might be okay with, right? And we were talking about like, I don't know, someone feels like they're addicted to caffeine or something like that. But there's another level where like, there's not like a mystery about it, right? I mean, there's certain hard drugs that are out there, gambling, addictions, things where it's just anyone looks at that situation and it's just very clear that someone's life is just falling apart at the seams. People feel a lack of control, and they're in immense pain, and often family members and people around them are, right? There's in between that, there might be gray areas of what we call an addiction or not. But the core of it universally is it has to do with this core element of attachment, clinging, and aversion, which is universal. There's not anyone that I've met on the planet. I mean, maybe some saintly beings that I didn't see any, but I don't know. For all I know, they could still have areas where they're attached. It's a quality of the human mind of attachment, right? And someone once asked Ram Dass actually about the difference between experiencing something as a loss versus experiencing something as a change. You know, and they were talking about the nature of death and dying, and also the fact that everything's changing. And Ram Dass's answer was so simple and direct. He said attachment. Right? The difference between loss and change is attachment. So fundamental nature of this world is change. Right? There's nothing here that is solid or permanent or eternal. And this gets to core Buddhist teachings, as you know, right? Like, we're ignorant of this fact. We also, out of this ignorance, there's fear of this change. And so we try and cling to things so that we can feel at ease, so we can feel some sense of peace. And that gives us a temporary sense of relief, of being safe. The issue is that everything that we're clinging to is going to go away, and we're going to be really unprepared for the loss of that. That's a core element of the human mind, and the nature of it is suffering on every level, from the most minuscule and subtle to the biggest, the biggest, most harmful addictions we can think of. It's all the same. It's all this comes down to the same core element of what it means to be human.
Thank you for that. And the reason I ask is because, to be forward, a big purpose of wanting to have this podcast, and from my work with BRN, is I want to change people's perspective on what addiction is, because I think people have a very solid idea of what addiction is. And addiction is the person, on the street, a homeless person holding a bottle of vodka, or a person shooting up heroin or something. And I think what the Buddhist perspective can show us is that just the very fact that we are here at all means that we are attached at some level, right? And I think the saying, as above, so below, is very helpful here, because a lot of people listening to this will have their own addiction, and obviously that causes immense suffering. To have that in your life, I have personal experience. Many people will have personal experience. That being said, it at some level offers a very interesting or promising opportunity, because you are able to kind of zoom in on this very loud addiction and study the components of it and say, okay, well, if this is how this addiction is working at this level, I can give me some insight of how addiction is working at maybe more subtle levels. And that is brilliant in terms of your practice, because I think one level to understand Buddhism is the Buddha laid out this very systematic, pragmatic way to loosen these attachments. And I believe that we as a society need to broaden our understanding of what addiction is, because that also, with that, brings more empathy, because it's not an other. There's not this separation of, this is where someone is, quote, an addict, and I'm not one of those. It's everyone's kind of on the spectrum, and it's on us to be super honest with ourselves, to think, where am I on this, and what practices can I do to loosen this? Because as you mentioned, and this is one of those kind of, sayings of capital T truth, which I don't know if it is true, but I think it is that with any level of attachment or addiction comes suffering, because that is the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha, right? The first one, life is suffering, and it comes from attachment, and if you lessen attachment, you lessen suffering. So my next question for you is bringing back love. What role does love have on loosening these attachments? And maybe even before you tackle that question, and I'm asking you big questions today, but this might be the biggest. What is love? What is love, and how can love help with these attachments?
Mm-hmm. Well, something that came to mind as you were sharing that last piece is, right, so there's spectrums of suffering and spectrums of attachment and addiction, and but it's not just addiction to certain substances and the behaviors around that can cause immense suffering to people and their families, but a very seemingly culturally sanctioned addiction is the addiction to power. That addiction in particular causes probably more suffering on this planet than potentially any other. Yeah. Right? I mean, really, we're talking about there's such a strong need that empathy and compassion and all these other innate qualities aren't able to be at the forefront, and so just pain and suffering is just spread apart. One single person can just through that addiction to power can cause millions upon, if not billions of people to increase their suffering. So my mind went there, and then you asked this question, and so let's pause for a moment on just the nature of the addiction to power. I think this is true about any addiction, but sometimes zooming in on the specific can help us land on the universal. Yep. So there's some need for power, right? And what's at the core of that? The core of that is always some sense of not being enough, not being lovable, having some need, like that there's got to be some certain level of power to feel okay. And unfortunately, and this is right, like the idea of the hungry ghost, this is the nature of attachment and addiction, is that there's actually no amount of that can satisfy. Yeah. So whatever level is gotten, then there's more, and it's just this endless, right? But if we recognize what's at the core of that, which is it's a lack of feeling okay, because it's a lack of experiencing being enough. That is one quality of what love is. Yeah? When we love someone, they are enough. Yeah? And when we love ourselves, we are enough. And when we feel love, unconditional love, we feel a sense of being okay and feeling safe, feeling content, right? We feel filled up. And in those moments of unconditional love, for any of us that have been blessed enough to experience that in our life in some capacity or another, there's usually, in those moments, very little other desires floating around. The mind is very calm, we're very settled. We're not seeking outside ourselves. The moment is enough. And so that's why love is so important. Love is also our true nature. So this sense of being enough, of being okay, of being lovable just as we are, it's a beautiful gift as humans that we can offer that to each other. But the true gift of it is that we can start to learn that it's right there in our own being. And that is also the nature of God, by the way. Right? That this inherent divinity, this inherent okayness, this inherent beauty, love, peace, it's right there infused at the very foundation of existence in this own moment experience in our own body, mind, and being. And coming in contact with that is inherently transformational because it's the only actual true thing that can satisfy these cravings we have.
Yeah, that's, when you say that, it kind of reminds me of something, or brings up to something to mind, that love is the fulfillment of the promise that an addiction is lying about. Meaning, like, when people are engaging in their addiction, they're trying to get this thing, and they're using this thing over and over again, and they have this idea in their mind that I'm going to get what I want using this, and it's just never enough. And love, on the opposite side, that is what you're going for. That is the fulfillment of that, and that is inherently healing. And I think that addiction and love maybe can't coexist. But that being said, that's wonderful. I always try to put myself in the shoes of someone listening to this, and they could think that's wonderful. But I think many people earlier in their life come into the world with an open heart, and they're loving, and they're able to receive love. And they say, okay, I'm loving, I'm able to receive love, and then they get really hurt, or they get repeatedly hurt, and they close their heart off, and they put up a wall, and they say, that hurt way too much, I am not doing that ever again. And maybe they even pour an addiction over it to strengthen that wall, and say, I am not risking that. I'm not risking that ever again. So how can someone who doesn't have the kind of relationship that you've been very lucky to have, I've been very lucky to have, and when I say relationship, I mean a path in a tradition that opens you up to that. How can someone who has rightfully had to close their heart start to loosen that, open that up, and let love in, and start to love themselves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm thinking of a few things. The first is I'm going to tell a short story just about my own journey with addiction. And this will mostly just give some context to what I had just shared. And this may touch some people, but not others. But we can move into the practical after. When between the ages of largely 18 and 22, I was just a hotbed of anxiety that I didn't even know how to call it that. Right? A lot of that had to do with just male conditioning, right? Like just like this idea that like anxiety is a weakness, so you're not allowed to experience anxiety. So if I felt anxious, I wasn't even allowed to call it that in myself, right? So it's like kind of constantly like trying to run from what this experience was that I had when I was in social settings or whatever. And very quickly, alcohol and various drugs became a very easy escape from that anxiety and this general sense of dis-ease. And it got to the point where, right, because when you're young, like a lot of my friends were partying, quote unquote, and so you can kind of hide in that. But at some point, what I was doing started to become so apparent that even the other people in my social circles expressed concern, right? Where I was blacking out a few nights a week, you know, mixing alcohol with whatever other drugs were available. Just really just caught in this loop of constantly trying to ease the pain that I felt at just being me in my own body. Around that time, simultaneously, I also had a deep thirst for some spiritual truth. I started stumbling my way into various spiritual practices, trying them out, but largely found my way into taking psychedelics, which was my first opening into spiritual truth. It was confusing because that was jumbled in with all the other drugs and things I was doing. But I started to touch upon something through those practices that was deeper than my addiction. And finally, I had this culminating experience where it was on LSD, aided with the act of meditation, and me just essentially deciding that I was done. I had to figure out, I just had to know if something was true in this world. Essentially, I wanted to know if God was real. And what I touched upon in that moment, through sitting with my eyes closed and essentially kind of similar to the Buddha, you know, in a much less extreme way, in my own small way, just deciding I wasn't going to get up until I figured this out. I touched upon a place that was deeper than my mind, deeper than my body, deeper than any addiction, deeper than any pain, and what I perceived of as the essence of God and the essence of love. And it was the most beautiful thing that I had ever experienced. I came out of that and I saw so clearly that everything that I had been doing, besides those spiritual yearnings over those last few years, were an attempt to numb myself, right, to numb pain. But through that, I was also numbing myself to what was deeply and inherently beautiful about my own being. And that kind of put me in a unique position because that experience was so big that it was almost overnight that I just cut out like everything. Because I wanted that so much, and that was so much more beautiful than any other high that I had experienced. That also started me on a long journey of doing the actual work of making friends with my own experience, right? So when I talk about the power of love being transformational, I mean, that's just central to my own healing path. But I also think if we haven't had an experience like that, it's not necessary, because we can get little glimpses of it on the long way that can carry us forward. But what I do think can be a really powerful facet on any type of healing journey is this concept called creative hopelessness, where there's a point for many of us where we don't know if anything else will work, but we start to really understand in a deep way that what we are doing and all of the strategies that we keep employing over and over again, that they haven't worked, they don't work, and they never will. We're not going to get what we want from it. And understanding that type of creative hopelessness, that the strategies we're using are hopeless, that can arise a willingness to try something else, right? And then if we're in a good environment, like maybe the Buddhist Recovery Network, where we're surrounded by other people that can give support, then maybe we can have some wise guidance of just things that we can try out and resources that we can take refuge in. And none of that requires belief, just willingness to try. But often a big first step in any type of healing is just a recognition that what we are doing isn't going to work anymore.
Thank you for that, and thank you so much for being willing to share your own journey. It takes a lot of courage, and I know that it's going to really, really help people listening. So thank you for that. And when you mention what you were just talking about, this creative hopelessness, I feel like another word for that could be surrender. And I think surrender is a difficult concept, and it's a big concept, and it's one that I wrestle with. Is there a way that in your path you have been able to cultivate this concept of surrender in a helpful way? Is it something that, do you think this is something that it just has to kind of get to a certain point in your life where surrender is inevitable, or is there a way to kind of cultivate surrender in one's life?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because we can't will surrender. That's one really core element. It's like trying harder to surrender isn't what surrender is.
Yeah.
So because of that, there's this element of it, of the concept of surrender, usually coupled with the concept of grace. And again, neither of those terms have to have any type of outside higher power. Just an understanding that our own effort isn't going to do it, and that it has to come from a deeper place. But that's not fatalistic or nihilistic, because there are things that we can do to maybe make us surrender prone.
Yeah.
And that creative hopelessness I talked about is a big one. So, for instance, to use mindfulness techniques, to start to practice an urge to do something that we're trying to stop doing, can we practice for a period of time just being really present with all the feelings that come up leading up to the act of engaging with whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
Reaching for a drug, or exploding in anger, right? Whatever this change is that we're wanting to make. Can we start to just really, in a curious, empathetic, compassionate way, get to know all the changing phenomenon in our body sensations, even like the concept of an urge, right? I mean, this is something I'll ask people, like, what does an urge feel like, right? We have to sit with an urge long enough to even be able to formulate some statement of like where we feel an urge, what it feels like. And so getting to know that, getting to know what it feels like when we engage the moment of the act we're doing. And again, non-judgment is a big part of it, because the truth is, it feels good.
Yeah.
We feel a sense of relief in the moment. Even if it's like yelling at someone or punching something, it's what we're doing in that moment is relieving this uncomfortable feeling of anger.
Yeah.
Right after that, we might feel guilt or, all those other things, but we need to deeply understand that all behavior is done for a reason, and we need to know, like, what are we getting out of this behavior, right? How is it functioning for us? And that requires non-judgmental awareness. And then being deeply aware of the effects, how we feel after, right? That's one way that can increase that sense of creative hopelessness, right? That what we're doing doesn't work, right? This willingness to maybe try something else. And I'll end with this, an image that I like is it's like, let's say we're in a hole in the ground, 10 feet in the ground, and we have a shovel and we're just digging. And the act of surrender, the act of creative hopelessness would be just recognizing that what we're doing is we're digging ourselves deeper into a hole, and that what we actually want is to get out of the hole. And the act of surrender is just letting go of the shovel.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what we're preparing ourselves to do, is to let go of the shovel. We still don't know how to get out, and realistically, we're going to need help, and we're going to need community, and there's probably new skills we need to practice, right? But the first thing is that we have to prepare ourselves and have some reason to start to understand, I need to let go of this, and also it's okay to let go of this. It might be uncomfortable, but I can. And I'm going to be okay.
Thank you for that. And as we're wrapping up, I do want that just leads perfectly into what I wanted to ask you about, which is this idea of community, and specifically I wanted to talk about the Sacred Community Project. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and what your goals are for that. I just would love to give you the opportunity to speak about that, because I think it's just so important and beautiful, and can bring so much love and healing into the world.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'd love to talk about it. So the Sacred Community Project is an inner spiritual nonprofit that works to lower the barriers of contemplative and devotional practices. When I say that we're inner spiritual, it means a few different things. One is that we interfaith with a lot of different spiritual and faith traditions. But two, the reason why we have the term inner spiritual rather than interfaith is that inner spiritual is a term that specifically points to the unity that unifies all these different traditions together. So that is an important stance. We have a core truth claim that we're just honest about, which is that there is just an underlying essence of reality, and different traditions call it different ways, different traditions relate to it in different ways, and because of that, there's this beautiful spectrum of different spiritual paths and practices and traditions. The ways that we lower the barriers of access to contemplative and devotional practices is a fewfold. One, there's free, low-cost, and donation-based offerings, books, audiobooks, music, retreats. We have I'm not sure when this is coming out, but we have 2 retreats coming up, one at the end of May and then one towards the end of the summer in August. We do outreach to the prison system. Just in this last year, I was down in a prison in San Diego and leading kirtan there. I'm hoping to do a few more before the year's over. We respond to letters from people in prison that reach out. But one of the big ways that the Sacred Community Project actualizes its mission is through free and donation-based spiritual support that we do largely online over Zoom. So what that looks like is that anyone who feels like they're struggling on their spiritual path, in whatever way that means to them, they can reach out to the Sacred Community Project, and we will get them connected with one of our trained spiritual support peer coaches, and you'll have a chance to one-on-one with someone, sit down and to talk about your spiritual journey, talk about your practices, talk about the areas where you're feeling stuck, and you'll have just a loving presence there with you to, together as a team, kind of help your your path get unstuck a little bit.
Yeah.
The other big one that we have is we have ongoing what we call satsang hangs, which are like spiritual support groups, like open process groups, where we come together as a group a few days a week, and it's a space where in 1 hour someone could talk about the depths of their suffering, someone could talk about the grief, someone could talk about an addiction they're working through, someone could talk about a spiritual experience they just had, someone could talk about a practice they're struggling to get back to, and it's all allowed and it's all considered to just be one tapestry of what it means to be human and what it means to be a part of spiritual community. So that's just a little snapshot of some of the things we offer, and if anyone feels inspired about any of that, it's just sacredcommunityproject.org. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really encourage people to reach out. It's such a wonderful community, and it's offering such an important service. The last question I'll ask before I ask where people can find you and talk about some of the things you're working on is I like to think about the state of those listening to this, and there could be people right now listening to this in a very dark time, in the midst of an addiction or any other darkness they have in their life. And I hope that the words that this podcast produces, and I know the words that you have thus spoke, can heal and reach those people. But to kind of round this out, what would you say to them? What could you offer those listening right now who may be in the midst of suffering at this very moment?
When we're in the midst of the most agonizing moments, being lost in suffering, it's the only thing that we can see. And we experience it as like it's like this. It's just like completely covering our eyes, and it's just complete darkness, and there's nothing else that we can see. And it's often hard to muster a belief there's anything outside of that. And so I just acknowledge that experience, and I acknowledge how real it feels. I'm not trying to minimize that. But it's not true. It's not the only thing that exists. And even though it makes total sense that we think that, the truth is that we are bigger and vaster and deeper than our suffering. That we are larger and more expansive than any experience that we have. And that includes even the seemingly biggest, most overwhelming sufferings imaginable. Even those, we are still more expansive and deeper than those. And that is the proof that the suffering will pass, and that there's space for something else to emerge.
Sitaram Das, thank you so very much. If people listening to this are interested in learning more about you, connecting with you, would like to learn more about something you're working on currently or putting out, where can people find that information and connect?
Yeah, so there's two main areas. Of course, as I already said, sacredcommunityproject.org is the name of the nonprofit that I run. And then my own website is sitaramdas.com, and that has all of my offerings as well as links to contact me, or yeah, it's all accessible there. So either of those places is a good way.
Okay. Thank you so very much, Sitaram Das. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, really. Thank you. Really.